Hi, I'm Ashley. Today I'm continuing with my fantasy sea animal paintings on watercolor canvas, and this one is a dolphin. So I did learn some things in my last painting on watercolor canvas of a seahorse, and I did use that to improve my efficiency on this one, but I actually learned more about myself in this painting. So it did take me 45 minutes from start to finish, and that included the sketching and the drying time, but it definitely should have been faster, which I'll get into throughout this video. I started with a very light pencil sketch here. I'm still fairly tentative when it comes to sketching, so I hover over the page a lot, but the dolphin really isn't actually that hard to sketch, so I definitely recommend it for beginners. When you're using a reference, focus on following the curves of the line versus just thinking about the final image. If you just follow the curves and only think about each curve and then that curve in relation to the previous curve, your drawing will turn out much better. I did use a kneaded eraser to lighten the pencil marks so that it wouldn't show through the watercolor, since watercolor is transparent. I add a little bit more definition to the face, focusing on some of the facial features, and then I decided to alter my lines a little bit just to make the proportions a little bit more accurate. Once I'm happy with the sketch, I get my watercolors activated. So I do use tube paints, which I squeezed into a plastic palette and then let them dry or cure. So when you're using dried watercolor paints like that, you just spray the palette down very generously with a spray bottle. Let it sit for 15 to 20 seconds. Kind of time depends on what quality of paints you have. The more high quality paints will usually activate more quickly. But then you'll have little kind of puddles of watercolor that are juicy and ready to go. My dolphin will be green, but I wanted it to actually have a gradient from like the vivid green on the back to a softer bluish color for the lighter belly area. To achieve that, I started with a very light wash of cobalt blue covering the whole shape. To get that light wash, just mixed a lot of water in with the blue. Then I lifted out the paint for highlight areas. So on my watercolor seahorse video, I talked about how easily the paint is lifted from this type of watercolor canvas, which can be super awesome or it can be really frustrating. But because of what I learned in that painting, I take advantage of it here as well as later in the painting with doing quite a bit of lifting for the highlights. While it's still wet, I add sap green, focusing on the darkest area of the dolphin first, and then just let it bleed out toward the lighter areas. In areas where it's not bleeding as well because it's dried a little bit more, just add some clean water and gently scrub at the edges. And then I again kind of make sure to lift out the paint where I want to preserve highlights. As I add more, I focus on shadow areas and then building up the darkest part of the dolphins. I'm really just looking at the values at this stage, so big picture. Where are the darks? Where are the lights in the painting? I learned from the last painting that glazing on this canvas really doesn't work because the paint does lift and reactivate so easily. So I'm avoiding any details and working pretty quickly with wet on wet or damp versus trying to let it dry fully and then working in layers. I'm also utilizing that ease of lifting the paint off the canvas to correct some of the shape of the fins and really kind of dial in the shape that I want. After getting that ombre effect, I add another very light wash of cobalt to bring some of that blue back in. And then again, lift out some highlights while it's still damp. Now, the more shadowed parts are going to be like a cooler bluish green color versus that bright vivid green or warmer green. So I added that bluish color to the back fin to really push it back behind the dolphin. And then I add that same color to like the bottom edge of the dolphin and the top edge. And that creates volume and makes the dolphin look more rounded and three-dimensional. And then I pretty much just repeat the process of adding darker colors and blending out the edges until it reached the intensity that I want. I paint the background in a medium wash of Prussian blue. I started with a big swatch at the top. Don't really know why, but then I came to my senses and started to paint kind of the more detailed areas around the dolphin. This wash is pretty watery in terms of the pigment to water ratio. So that allows me to really spread it out and have those beads of paint that I can draw out and have a slightly more even wash. The brush that I'm using, though, it comes to a really good point, but it holds a lot of paint and water without letting it like drip. It releases it at a like consistent rate. So because of that, I can use a decent sized brush even for the smaller areas. Now, I'm not super worried about getting a really even wash here because I want texture in the water. So I'm actually going to intentionally add some mixtures with more water on top of damp or like less watery areas. And that creates intentional cauliflower edges, which just adds that interest in that texture. After getting the basic wash in, I waited about 15 seconds to let it dry partially. So it's not all the way dried, but it's starting to dry some. And then I add a much more pigmented version of the same color for the shadow behind and between the fins of the dolphin. By waiting those few seconds to let it start to dry, it really controls the spread of the new color. I decided to lift some highlights using a clean, minimally damp brush to emphasize the contrast of the light and the dark. And then I add some splatters of clean water and some of that darker mixture while the background is still damp. This adds extra texture, but since it is damp, it'll bleed and blend out naturally, so it's not too splattery looking. In some of the areas where it was drier, I do gently blend out some of those dark splatters to preserve the texture, but to prevent just like polka dots in the background. Once I was happy with the background, I did return to the dolphin and started adding darker, contrasting areas. Now, I didn't wait for the background to be dry before doing this, so you'll see some bleeding. To avoid this, just wait for the background to dry before going on to the main subject. But I was impatient and ended up working over it later. I start to add some minor details with the transition from the back color to the highlighted belly and the separation between the fin and the body. And then I lift out the highlights of the dolphin. The face was dry, so I did kind of scrub a little bit to lift out that highlight, which again works really great on this watercolor canvas. And now that the background is dry, I clean up and refine the edge again. So I do add some more textured marks with dots and dry brushing on the dolphin's back. More splatters because they're fun. I do sort of cover the dolphin with my hand after some splatters get onto him, but you'll see that those splatters are super easily lifted off while they're wet by just touching them with a clean and minimally damp brush. Now I'm adding just another layer of color to the shadowed side of the water and more mostly clean water splatters. I've been talking about how easily the watercolor lifts from the canvas, but you can really see that demonstrated here. So when I was splattering, a drop of that water got on kind of the tail part of the dolphin. And when I tried to remove it, it immediately lifted that part of the subject. So now there's a very distinct highlight on the back of the dolphin behind the dorsal fin, and I don't want it there. So I gently add pigment and then move some of the paint from nearby to that area to blend it back out. And then here's where I really just needed to stop fiddling and let it dry completely. I had lost the edge on the back of the dolphin because of working on the dolphin before letting the water dry. So I really should have just stopped then when it started bleeding and let it dry. But I didn't until here. If I had stepped away before, I might have also determined that I kind of liked those cauliflower edges on the dolphin's back. Looking at it back when I'm making the voiceover for this video, I actually kind of liked it in that stage where it was like a lost edge with those cauliflowers on it on the dolphin's back. It was kind of interesting, but can't go back to that now. So now that I finally did let it dry, I can go in and clean up some of the edges. So I add kind of a thick dark green to the entire back edge of the dolphin and then blend that out with a damp brush again. This kind of did push the pigment toward the edges because I had a little bit too much water on my brush for this specific painting surface. And I was getting just really frustrated and annoyed at this point. I also was painting when my kids were supposed to be sleeping, but they weren't. And they kept running out of the rooms. So I was getting pretty distracted by my kids also. So the combo of those things just really didn't help my patience. I finally got it to where the edge looked okay. And then I worked on the bottom half a little bit more. So I again lift out some areas on the dolphin, really to highlight around the dolphin's eye and mouth. And lifting is very satisfying. I love watching that paint just lift off of the canvas. I did subtly add the mouth and some shading here to define kind of the nose of the dolphin. And then I added the eye. I further define each of those features, and then I fiddle unnecessarily for about 3 more minutes. And then I fiddle with the back and the background also. So overall, I definitely could have cut this off a while ago, but I was just kind of annoyed and fiddly, and I still struggle sometimes with just stopping. Drop a comment if you struggle with this also, and if you have overcome it, let me know your secrets. I'd be super interested in it. So I wish that I would have left that top edge alone a little bit more so that I didn't have quite that like harsh dark line. And again, I kind of liked it in that cauliflowery stage, but overall I am still happy with where this painting landed in the end. So, you know, no harm, no foul, I guess. I'm also happy that I just was able to learn a lot going back and rewatching this video. So thanks so much for watching, and I hope you learned something like I did when I made this video. Have an awesome day.